Welcome to Two Roads Crossing, a podcast production of the Christian Veterinary Mission. Do you wonder how your faith fits together with your profession? Well, join us as we explore how to live well at the intersection of two roads crossing.
Well, hello and welcome back to Two Roads Crossing, a podcast production of the Christian Veterinary Mission as we explore the intersection of faith and vocation. My name is Barry Schwenk. I'm a veterinarian, a pastor, and your host as we dive into yet another discussion, part 4 of a discussion with Dr. Karen Stoufer. Karen, welcome back. It's good. It seems like
Thanks.
Seems like only yesterday we were having this conversation. If you have missed parts 1 through 3, you should check those out as Karen and I have been talking about the intersection of gospel and culture, and specifically, we've been looking at honor-shame cultures, and it's fun. You know, Karen has spent. Did you say it was? How long did you say that you all were in Nepal?
We were there 13 years.
Okay, 13. I almost said 30. I'm like, that's not right. It's been 30 with CVM though, hasn't it?
Yeah, a little more.
Yeah. Karen and her family were in Nepal for 13 years, and then as they transitioned back to the United States, served as the area director for Asia for CVM for an extended period of time, and also as training director. And it's as the training director that we got to interact more and really. You helped to expose me to this particular topic, and so I've just been looking for it. So I've been so excited to have this conversation with you. At the end of part 3, where we left off, we were having we're discussing the honor shame culture as it pertains to education and training. And it's really especially important because as veterinarians, whether you are working in a U.S. clinic setting, or maybe you're in a third world country working in a remote village, doesn't matter whether you're in pharmaceuticals, it doesn't matter whether you're in research, it doesn't matter where you are as a veterinarian. Veterinarians engage with education and training all the time. That's a big portion of what we do as professionals. And last time, Karen, the more that you brought up, the more I realized as you were talking about the kind of the pillars of honor shame culture, the norms, acceptable norms of honor shame cultures in a general sense, the more I realized that there were probably a lot of ways that we have maybe been unintentionally offending someone, especially if we don't understand that honor shame context. So in order to prevent this, or even understand times when maybe people were offended by us and we didn't quite understand why, could you elaborate on areas where offense might occur when we're working in this cross-cultural kind of situation?
Sure. I did come across a cultural guide to 5 things that we as Westerners, or even just specifically North Americans, say that may unintentionally shame or dishonor those who come from those cultures. And the first would be to introduce somebody as my friend when we don't really know them very well, or to refer to them by their first name, such as, "Hi, this is Mick," when we should be using their title and their position. "This is Dr. Warwick, the clinic owner." So this would help our honor shame friend know where Dr. Warwick fits into the hierarchy. Many cultures never even use first names at all, but would use older brother or younger sister to convey honor, respect, position. And a second really common one would be to say, or even just think, "Please look at me when I'm speaking to you." Because as Americans, we really value eye contact. But in many honor shame cultures, it's polite and respectful to look down. It would be understood as defiance if you looked your boss in the eye. And I was actually part of a hiring process here in the US where we interviewed a very qualified candidate of Asian heritage. And she wasn't hired partly because she looked down when she answered some of the questions in the interview rather than at the interviewer. And I'm sure she was trying to be respectful, not deceitful, which is what was interpreted by the interviewer.
That's really interesting, because those, um, for a lot of us, those are just kind of natural. It's the way I was raised to stand up, shake hands firmly, look somebody squarely in the eye. Um, I ran into these sorts of uh, cues, or even places where it was easy to offend, in Ethiopia. Even titles, titles are really important. And for me, there were times where being referred to as Dr. Barry, you don't need to call me Dr. Barry. Oh, yes, they do. that was part of it. Even the way that you greet someone, the way you introduce someone, all of those things were really important. And I found in Ethiopia, they even had a formal tense for their verbs. So when you were conjugating, which for me was always kind of a nightmare anyway, I thought that I could just learn one tense of a verb and get away with that. But having informal tenses and then formal tenses were really important. And it's funny how those things from a cultural perspective are so important. So there's something else I ran into. Did you ever run into food as being part of as part of a way to either offend or respect somebody? Because we run into that a lot too.
Absolutely. And a really easy to make mistake would be to ask a guest if they'd like to have something to drink or something to eat. And I know I've made this mistake many times, but in many honor shame cultures, you don't ask, you just bring the refreshments. If you ask, do you want something to eat? That kind of implies that you're annoyed with their visit and you really hope they leave soon and don't want anything. Another one that's really complex is gift giving. It's such a social interaction, and it often creates the need to reciprocate at the next occasion. So if you give too expensive or valuable a gift, that can shame the person who will be unable to reciprocate that. Similarly, if they gave you a gift and you give one back that's significantly less in value than what they gave you, that could be understood as an insult when you didn't mean that at all. And we talked last time about the importance of accepting an invitation to coffee. But in many honor shame cultures, for instance, if your student asks you to go to coffee, you should not offer to pay afterward, which you might naturally do as a North American and probably better off than your student. Since the student did the inviting, and it probably was to reciprocate because they appreciate how much you helped them in class, if you offer to pay, that shames them and it removes their opportunity to even their social debt with you.
Yeah, that's interesting, because there are some real tendencies that we have that we think are acts of charity, acts of kindness, that again, that aren't intended to offend, but I could see where that could create a stumbling block. What about the opposite now? So what are some things that maybe are intended to be respectful in an honor shame culture that might rub us the wrong way coming from a different cultural context?
There certainly are, just the reverse. So they would ask us about our health and our family and serve us refreshments and drive the North Americans mad because they won't get down to business. They're doing all of that first, which to them is essential to show respect. They often ask, how old are you? Because age is really important. And in many languages, like you mentioned with the verbs, the noun is different. So the pronoun for you is different depending on your age relative to theirs. They want to be respectful. They want to make sure they use the correct pronoun and the correct title. So in Nepal, one time, my husband Ron was trying to build relationships with a village leader, and he was referring to him as younger brother in a respectful manner. But after a few weeks, the leader asked him, why do you call me younger brother? How old are you? And when Ron told him, the leader was really surprised and explained he thought Ron was much younger. And the leader hadn't been able to understand why Ron didn't call him older brother as he should have. He just couldn't figure out if it was supposed to be an insult or if Ron just didn't speak the language properly. And then at the end, the leader finally said, well, that's fine then. You can call me younger brother. You're fat is another one that shocks a lot of Americans.
Thank you, Karen. I appreciate that. Oh, my goodness.
It's a compliment. It's a sign of wealth and power in a lot of the world. And so it's a respectful thing that they want to say to you. How much money do you make is another one that we ran into really often, because wealth is a sign of status. And the person who's asking is generally just trying to figure out how to show appropriate respect. They're not really trying to snoop into your private business. Another one that was hard for us to get used to is that in many cultures, the response to embarrassment is to laugh rather than to blush or apologize. So one time when my daughter fell down, tripped and fell in the Asian village where we lived, the women at the farm there just started laughing and laughing. It felt like they were laughing at her, but actually they were laughing to cover up so that she wouldn't lose face by falling. They were trying to be kind with their laughter.
It's again, I can remember once in Ethiopia, was going in to get a leather jacket, and I walked in, and the shop owner just looked at me and he said, no, not for you, not enough cows. And I remember getting so offended because my wife thought it was hilarious. But he was just being very honest and respectful about not only what he had the capability of doing, but also felt like, by pointing out that I was rather large, that was a good thing. So I've been on that end. And most of those that you mentioned, those hit home, way too close to home, actually. And I think that really it's in that cross-cultural setting, it's not only is it hard just learning to live cross-culturally when you're talking about moving to a different place and being immersed in that way, but even when you're here in your home country, learning how to communicate and be sensitive to cross-cultural tendencies can be really challenging, because worldviews can be very different. And just because we live in the same country doesn't necessarily mean that we have the same worldviews. And I've been guilty of this. There have been times where I have been offended by something that someone has done or said. And I can guarantee that people have been offended by the things that I've said and done without even intending to be offensive. And it's, I kind of expected it, moving, to a different country, but even here in the United States, learning to communicate with folks within my church, parents of the kids that I coach and things like this. Now that I'm more aware of it, it really has, shown a light on how I should be at least aware and adjust. How did you adjust or navigate your time working in an honor shame culture?
It's not easy. The first thing I did was to try to make really good relationships with a few of my national colleagues that I could depend on to actually give me cultural and worldview insights or guidance, maybe not the why, but at least the how I should behave. Prayer is a good tool. Thinking, what would Jesus do, is a good tool. But one of the most helpful tips I learned for myself, at least, was the phrase, so what? So I would find if someone was doing or telling me something and it seemed totally irrelevant or unimportant, and my mind is silently thinking, so what? That's a cue for me to stop and ask, could this be a cultural issue? This is really important to them to do it this way. Why is that? And so whenever I had the internal reaction of, so what? I would try to slow down and look at the issue from a different perspective. It was a really good example. One time I had a really busy afternoon in the office, and a staff member brought a relative into my office to see me. Now, this is not the clinic with an animal, this is an office. And she just started telling me about how they were related through a distant third cousin and uncle kind of relationship. And it seemed way unnecessarily long. And I just wanted to know, why is this man in my office? And I thought, your cousin, whatever, so what? But I didn't say it out loud. And that's when I realized that this introductory dialogue was really important, because in honor shame culture, who you are, your genealogy, is where most of your honor or shame comes from. And my staff wanted me to know that this was an honored person, and that she wanted to be sure he was treated with honor and respect and listened to, as well as she was respecting him. And what he would eventually say would not be nearly as important as who he was. And I think in our veterinary practices, we need to pray for discernment on when we listen to client stories. As much as possible, we want to be honoring, we want to be good listeners. We also know at the same time, the other exam rooms are all full, and a lot of these stories are not even related to the patient's presentation. But as ambassadors for Christ, we need to listen for clues in the story, not only regarding the patient, but also the identity and the context of the owner. We need to think, why is telling this story important to this client? And how can we show honor and affirmation to them as a person?
You know, that is, I love that tip, because I found that coming from a time sensitive or a time based culture, I'm right there with you. I'm ready to move on to the next exam room because I've got things I have to get done, and that goes back to even, you know, that root of guilt innocence that we talked about, you know, in our first conversation. It's all performance based. And so therefore time is very, very important, because I need time to prove myself, to perform, to do all of those things. And yet in an honor shame culture, it's very socially based. And for someone that comes from a different context, I can see where you have to be intentional about slowing down and assign and seeing where that value is, because ultimately that's what it's all about, right? You just said that you want to be Christ honoring to the people around you. And I think that as veterinary professionals that are followers of Christ, our desire, that should be our ultimate desire, which is to act in a Christ-like way towards everyone around us. That's the love your neighbor as yourself. And even if your neighbor doesn't do things the same way that you do them. And I find it amazing that as we've been talking about even how the gospel is tailored to meet those cultural tendencies, no matter what our context is, our hearts are all shaped in a way that the gospel fits. And even though we may see it slightly differently, we may have different cultural biases, the gospel fits into that perfectly. And in the end, it's not about us changing to meet Christ, but rather Christ meeting us and then changing us. So let's take this one step further. We need to understand cultural context. I get that. As veterinary professionals, we may have to adjust what we do and what we say and how we say it, especially in honor shame cultural situations. When we come from a different cultural background, if we're going to be respectful and show honor in a Christ-like way, one of the things that I learned from you over the years has to do with a training method called participatory training. And CVM is not the only one that uses this training method, but for veterinarians, especially as I started using this within clinic settings, I use this when I coach kids, soccer, swimming, you name it. Like I use these participatory methods, and it's been really helpful. How does participatory training fit together in this context where we're talking about the intersection of gospel and culture?
Well, in participatory training, we believe the learner is responsible for the learning, not the instructor. So the instructor's role is just to be a facilitator of learning, to provide the resources and the environment where learners can discover for themselves and learn. So we want to honor our learners. We want to respect their knowledge and their skills. So in Nepal, for example, when we were training farmers, many had never been to school and they were barely literate in their own language. They would come to the animal health training course saying they knew nothing. And we would start by challenging that assumption. We ask about their livestock, what they own, what kinds they raise, and all their experiences. We ask them about livestock problems. For instance, they might mention a disease they've seen, and we would ask them to describe the clinical signs, the duration, the probable outcome. How many get sick? Do they recover? Do they die? And once we had a pretty clear idea of the disease they're talking about, we would honor that knowledge and experience, and then we would offer them some of our experience with that same disease. Perhaps we know a more scientific or specific name for it. We probably would suggest an available medicine or treatment that we've seen to be helpful in our experience. And we try to honor them by respecting what they already know and then add to it by coming alongside. We also tried to always find tactful ways to correct and guide people and worked hard to avoid shaming someone for a wrong answer in the class. We encouraged them to share their local or indigenous treatments that they've tried and talked about whether they had success or failure with that.
It's that's a real departure. That is, for again, for someone coming from a time-based culture, whether you're in a US clinic setting or whether you're on a mission trip somewhere remotely, time is precious, and we have things that have to get done, because if we're going to report the total number of things that we've vaccinated or patients that we've seen, we have to get moving. And participatory training really, once again, really slows us down into a social mindset as opposed to a time-based mindset. It's far more relational, and it does indeed empower and honor the people that you're working. It helps to develop relationship. I don't know, when you think about U.S. training methods, you wouldn't necessarily say that you have a relationship with the teacher or the trainer, unless after you're done with the training, you engage with them or so on. But participatory training allows for relational development even from the very beginning. And unfortunately, that's not how we were taught. For most of us in the U.S., that's not how we were taught, which means that it's not the way that we teach. If we're going to reflect what we've received, we teach the same way that we have been taught. And we may need to think differently about that. So how does our Christian faith then integrate with this kind of training in a way that we can actually honor those participants and the students in a Christ-like way?
It integrates really well. When we're honoring our trainees, we honor all of them and to our staff as well. So we try to be sure that we honor those who are traditionally shamed. We would honor lower level staff, women, discriminated or oppressed minority groups, those without education, those with disabilities. If the training, so on a practical side, if the training was near my home, then my family would come and I would introduce the trainees to my family in ways that made the trainees feel important that I would do that. If the training was remote, we would always, as trainers, stay in the same condition as the trainees, either with primitive beds or on straw on the floor or whatever. We didn't make distinctions. And some of my colleagues were good at using humor to promote the kind of honoring culture that we want, but humor is real tricky, and I never felt comfortable using it with those I didn't know well.
That nuance can be there's a fine line between appropriate and inappropriate, even within our own cultural context. I find it so interesting how our cultural context does impact us on many different levels, even in something that, as veterinary professionals, we may have neglected to see the importance of cultural context within teaching and training situations. And I can see how participatory training and this particular approach fits well to not only promote a healthy learning environment, but also an opportunity for relationships, and a great way to model the gospel. Of course, like, hearing these things also kind of causes some flashbacks, a little PTSD about all those times and rounds when I was pointed out and singled out and publicly humiliated because I didn't remember the right dosage or I gave the wrong answer. And usually the anger of my professor was a catalyst to kind of push me to do better the next time. But I'm guessing that in an honor shame culture context, that would not work. Is that correct?
It certainly wouldn't work when you're trying to model Christ-like behavior in an honor shame culture. We always tried to model forgiveness and not getting angry. But in a traditional honor shame culture, a professor might shame a student for a wrong answer because of the hierarchy. And we try to model it differently and this is why Christians would stand out. Getting angry in an honor shame culture will cause a person to lose face or to be ashamed. And a person who gets angry loses honor or respect. Now, in America, many people think if you insist just a little louder or ask for the manager in order to get what you think you deserve, you'll get better service. But this technique would really backfire in an honor shame culture. Non-Christians in an honor shame culture seldom, if ever, practice forgiveness. If you're ashamed, you remain ashamed. If you get angry, you'll be written off as an angry person. Asking for forgiveness would never be enough. And it's unlikely you can ever remove the shame. You can try to restore honor. But this is why the good news of Jesus Christ is such good news. Only he can really remove shame from our past and give us honor.
I just love the way it's almost like God knew what he was doing. And so the answer is always in Christ. But as a follower of Christ, how do you do that? What does that look like daily as you live that out in your personal life, in your walk, your professional life?
Well, we certainly try to always honor our farm and clinic staff that work with us, never criticizing them in front of someone. We try to find opportunities to praise our coworkers and staff in front of clients. In fact, in many Asian cultures, you would never even correct someone face to face at all, even in private, much less in public. You would ask a third person to mediate that criticism. As an American, I might think, if you have something to say it to my face. But an Asian would be the opposite. If you really value our relationship, you would never cause me to lose face by criticizing me to my face. You would ask a mutual friend or colleague to deliver the message. So, personal example, I asked our receptionist in Asia in a private one-on-one meeting to try to come on time after she had been consistently late. I was wrong. It shouldn't have been done like that. And I learned to do it better in the future with a trusted coworker. Fortunately, I had a trusted coworker who was willing to give me feedback and help me learn to do that better. In another more serious example, I knew of another American missionary in Asia who discovered there was an employee stealing. Now, the missionary accused the employee in front of the staff. The accused staff was later proven guilty and left. But the real damage was that the rest of the staff could no longer respect the missionary, since they had caused the accused employee to lose face in public. The most important issue there was not the stealing, but how the accusation was done, causing loss of face. And so the missionary eventually had to leave that project. No one there would work with them.
And that's the shame. That's what we're trying to avoid. It breaks my heart to think about how just a little bit of better understanding, a little bit more self-awareness, a desire to connect with people on where they are within their own context, how that can change, and in a moment of even indiscretion or ignorance, we can damage our opportunity to be that Christ-like example for the people that are around us. And that's what we want to avoid. We want to avoid causing harm to the forward motion of the gospel. And thankfully, I think that as we are more aware of our own cultural bias and the cultural bias of others, we can be intentional and begin to adjust in a way that makes us more effective in serving others through both our vocation and our faith. This has been a wonderful time of conversation with you, Karen. I realize it's been 4 parts. It'd be great to have 100 more. Maybe I'll have to have you back. We can talk some more about this, or we have a plethora of other topics. But I really appreciate you and appreciate the time that you've given to us. It definitely gives me, even being aware of these things has given me a lot to think about, especially how the gospel applies and fits into every worldview within such a beautiful way. So hopefully, as a result of these conversations, for the folks listening, for myself, hopefully we will begin to start living more intentionally about recognizing and understanding and adjusting to the cultural perspectives of those around us. And together, through it all, we will learn how to live well at the intersection of 2 roads crossing.
Thank you for listening to 2 Roads Crossing, a podcast production of the Christian Veterinary Mission. If you are blessed by this content, like and subscribe so that you are alerted when new content is released. If you would like more information about CVM, or if you have questions, comments, or topical suggestions, you can find us online at www.cvm.org. Or you can contact us by emailing podcast@cvm.org. God has a plan for the nations, and that plan includes you. We pray that CVM has encouraged you to live out your calling with confidence and competence. So, until next time, may the voice of the shepherd ring loud and clear as you follow him in faith to the intersection of 2 roads crossing.